In our previous video, we introduced a main method and a class in Java, and just went over how to do the simple exercise of printing out to the console "Hello World" in Java. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about another rudimentary programming concept: variables, and also identifiers. So, before we begin with how to instantiate a variable and what syntax rules there are for an identifier, let's just go ahead and understand that Java has lots of different variable types, and this is important. We're not going to cover all of these right away, but a brief list includes integers, strings, characters, floats, doubles, shorts, longs. The list goes on. There's quite a few, and we're not going to be talking about all of those today and casting between them. What we're just going to be talking about is the simple idea of instantiating a variable. So before I can go ahead and define a variable and give it an identifier, I have to give it a type. And this is an important feature of Java. Java is strongly typed. If I do, let's say, number equals 1, and I try and run, it will tell me that there is an error, cannot find symbol. And the problem here is it's expecting me to give this variable a type. It doesn't understand the idea that I am telling it, I want you to save this, until I tell it, I want you to save this type of thing. Every variable in Java has a type, an identifier, and a primitive value that it's holding. Now, that value could be null. We can just create this variable without filling its value, and in which case the value is null. It doesn't have a value. So we've understood the type of a variable, or at least what that is. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the value of a variable, and we'll explain in detail what types can have what values in a future video. But you might be asking, the identifier, well, what's worth covering about that? Well, there's a couple important details here. There are a few reserved keywords that an identifier can't be. For instance, I can't do int static. I can't do int. In fact, there's quite a few reserved keywords and other things that I can't involve in my identifier. So one thing that can't be in there is a reserved word, like int static, public. There's lots to choose from. Class can't be in there. But another thing that I can't put in there is I'm not allowed to put in false, true. Oh, those should be capitalized. False, true, or null. And that's because these are actually values. Just as I can't go int 1, because that's a value, false is a value, true is a value, and null is a value. Now, we'll get into booleans later. So you don't have to really understand why those are a value just yet. So, every identifier must start with one of three things. It has to either start with a letter, like number. It can start with an underscore. Or it can start with a dollar sign. Oh, a dollar sign, not Stein. Where's that on my keyboard? For the dollar. Or number. It cannot start with false, true, or null. I think it can start with them, but it can't be them. And it also can't start with a digit. So I'm not, these here are allowed. And these here are not allowed. Now, something I didn't mention in my previous video is that to signify a comment in Java, you'll need 2 slashes. I also forgot to mention that semicolons must end every non-comment line, unless it's a curly bracket alluding to some function. So I'm not allowed, for instance, to go int one number. I'm not allowed to go int false. I'm not allowed to go int static. And let's do an inline comment to kind of have the compiler ignore these for a minute, so that you can see that the rest of this will compile. So if I compile and I run, you see it doesn't throw up an error with that. But if I remove this inline comment and I compile, you see, one, it's very confused. It says this is not a statement, it says this is not a statement. In summary, you're not allowed to do any of those, and we've just proven that. So, in this video we talked about valid and invalid identifiers. We talked about variable types and declaring variables and assigning values to variables. Now, one last thing that I didn't mention, and this is important. Java is case sensitive. Int number is not the same as int number with a capital N. And you have to be really careful about this because it can be very easy to make typos in your code, and obviously it's quite hard to spot them when you use capital letters, and that can be a source of some frustration. We'll go into conventions of how to name these various things later. One quick convention is don't name things with a $sign at the start. That's not something you're meant to be doing unless you're programming in bytecode. And in general, styling is something we'll cover in a lot of depth. There's a lot of styling conventions, but for now, the main things you need to focus on is every variable has a type, an identifier, and a value. And that value can be null. And when creating an identifier, you cannot start your identifier with, your identifier cannot be a reserved word. Your identifier cannot be a value like true, false, or null. And your identity cannot start with a digit. Alright, thank you for listening. In the next video, we're going to discuss the various types of variable, and we may touch on casting operations between variables. Thank you for listening.